Hey guys, tonight we trudge back in time, and not just any time, but into the dust-caked, hammer-clanging world where medieval castles first clawed their way out of raw rock. You probably won't survive this if you're thinking about doing it yourself. Stones weren't exactly specized. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself standing on a jagged hillside, mist curling around your ankles. The air smells of crushed stone, pine resin, and a faint tang of iron from your tools. You hear the distant clack of hammers, the groan of wooden levers, and the low rhythmic grunt of laborers heaving slabs. That's where it begins. The quarry? Massive slabs of limestone, sandstone, or granite jut from the earth like natural sculptures, their surfaces rough and stubborn. Quarrying was grueling work. Laborers chipped, pried, and levered blocks using iron picks, wedges, and wooden levers. You probably wouldn't last a day without losing a fingernail or worse. But back then, a day meant survival and a few copper coins in your rough palm. Most castles relied on local stone because transporting hundreds of tons over long distances was a logistical nightmare. Yet kings occasionally demanded stone from distant quarries to signal prestige. Or maybe just to make life more complicated for everyone. Historians still argue whether exotic stone shipments were mainly about status or necessity. You trudge along the edge of a sheer drop, thinking about the effort to extract a single block that weighs more than a car. Fringe tidbit. Some medieval masons believed certain quarries had lucky stones that resisted lightning or brought good fortune. Imagine carrying a cursed but lucky rock across muddy terrains like a gym membership with existential anxiety. Stone selection wasn't random. Experienced quarrymen tapped blocks, listening for a clear tone believed to indicate solidity. You squat, running your fingers along grain lines, imagining centuries of walls resting on this precise block. Some masons reportedly left tiny carvings on quarry stones as signatures or even secret messages a code-only fellow guild members could read. Scholars still debate whether these markings were ritualistic, practical, or just early graffiti. As you watch, apprentices gather fragments and chips, shaping them into smaller blocks or decorative pieces. Some historians suggest these scraps were even blessed before use, a curious fusion of labor and superstition. You brush dust from your sleeves and imagine the ceremonial care, a tiny prayer tucked into every wall. And yes, a few fringe theories propose that some stones were deliberately cursed to protect the fortress, though that may be more legend than fact. The quarry's environment is unforgiving. Morning frost makes stone brittle. Midday sun scorches exposed rock and scorches your palms. Sudden rain turns paths into slippery mudslides. You carefully navigate around huge blocks as a worker guides one down a slope with wedges and ropes, sweat dripping into your eyes. Historians still argue whether quarrying schedules were more about human endurance or natural conditions. Some suggest that winter offered firmer ground for hauling, while summer provided softer stone, easier to splitter, practical, if uncomfortable, trade-off. There's a rhythm to the work. Quarrymen learn intuitively which layers split cleanly, how to avoid fractures, and which wedges will pry a slab loose without shattering it. You imagine a team of a dozen men orchestrating each block's liberation, their energy synchronized like a dusty medieval ballet. Oddly enough, the quarry wasn't purely functionally, was social. Apprentices sang, masons swapped tales of rogue lords, and sometimes merchants sold spiced bread to keep morale high. Fringe evidence even hints that disputes over stone size or quality could be settled right on the quarry, face like an impromptu courtroom among boulders. The air vibrates with both danger and anticipation. Flying chisel fragments, sudden rock slides, and unstable ledges turn every moment into a gamble. Yet amid the chaos, patterns emerge. workers develop a tactile sense for stone density, learning to read the rock. You run a hand over a freshly split surface, feeling the latent promise of walls that will someday rise 10 meters high. One crack here, one chip there, and the stone's destiny shifts from raw quarry to fortress cornerstone. Even superstition infiltrates technique. Some masons sprinkled water over blocks before striking to ensure clean fractures. Others whispered prayers to protect the stone nor themselves from misfortune. You pause to appreciate the strange mixture of raw physics and mystical thinking. One historical fact: lime mortar, still used today, was often mixed nearby, its pungent, chalky scent curling into the morning air. Fringe tales insist some mortar included crushed eggshells, animal fat, or even crocodile dung, though the last is debated, probably more alchemical than culinary. As the sun begins to set, casting long, angular shadows across jagged slabs, you exhale, lungs heavy with dust and anticipation. The quarry rests in semi-darkness, but its silent promise lingers. Each stone, each carved mark, each superstition-laced choice holds a story waiting to be assembled. And you realize that the castle's journey begins here, in the sweat, songs, and subtle secrets of the quarry, long before the first wall rises. Remember that cursed quarry stone. Well, this is where it starts, its long pilgrimage toward immortality in mortar and legend. You grip the rough edges of the stone, muscles already screaming from quarry labor. And now the real ordeal begins. Moving this stubborn slab from its birthplace to the castle site. Picture a narrow, muddy trail winding through hills, river crossings, and forest clearings. Each step is an adventure, and each misstep could undo hours or days of effort. In the Middle Ages, transporting stone was a test of human endurance, animal strength, and sheer creativity. There are no cranes, no forklifts, no magic. Just oxen, wooden sledges, ropes, levers, and a lot of sweat hand. You're right in the middle of it. You probably wouldn't survive an hour of this, but in your imagination, you trudge alongside laborers, feeling every inch of effort in your own tired shoulders. Most stones didn't travel far. A few kilometers was usually the maximum, since even the strongest oxen have limits. But for castles meant to impress kings or to broadcast a lord's prestige, sometimes stone was hauled from distant quarries hundreds of kilometers away. Historians still argue whether long-distance transport was primarily a practical necessity, a symbol of status, or a subtle form of competition among rival nobles. You trudge alongside a team of oxen, the pungent aroma of dung and crushed stone thick in the air, listening to the groan of harnesses under strain. Fringe theories suggest that some stones were floated down rivers inside hollowed logs, a sort of primitive, raft romantic, slightly implausible, but delightfully imaginative. The workhorse of medieval stone transport is the sledge, a simple wooden platform on skids, reinforced with iron where possible. Teams of oxen strain against thick ropes while workers sprinkle water over the runners to reduce friction. You step carefully around the animals and the moving stone, acutely aware that one misstep could end badly. Commands are shouted sometimes in song to synchronize pulling. Some accounts even suggest that these songs carried coded instructions. A specific verse signaling lean left, another dig in harder. You imagine the absurd choreography. Laborers and animals moving in almost musical unison. Crossing rivers introduces new hazards. Temporary rafts or hastily built barges ferry stones across currents that could sweep them away in an instant. You cling to a rope, balancing on slick timbers as the water laps against the barge, your heart hammering. Fringe theories claim that stones were sometimes carved with tiny protective symbols or marks to ward off mishaps during water transport, a mix of superstition and practicality. Historians still debate how widespread this practice truly was. But the idea of a blessed stone bobbing downriver is irresistible. Steep hills present another challenge. You crouch low, pressing against a fulcrum, while teammates leverage long wooden beams beneath the stone. The wood creaks ominously as the rock inches upward. Every inch requires coordination and vigilance. One wrong move, and a stone could tumble back down the slope, crushing anything in its path. You probably wouldn't survive a miscalculation here. But the tension creates a strange exhilaration, a dangerous dance with physics. Some masons reportedly tested stone placement with rhythmic taps, listening for a solid tone. That indicated stability. A combination of intuition and brute force, sound and muscle, guiding massive weights through treacherous terrain. Weather controls the tempo. Rain turns trails into slick mudslides. Frost freezes sledges to the ground, and scorching sun saps energy from both oxen and laborers. You wipe sweat from your brow, tasting dust and pine, imagining dragging a ton of stone over hills and through streams. Fringe accounts hint that some stones were coated with pitch or resin to resist moisture, though evidence is sparse and debated. Still, the idea that medieval engineers experimented with waterproofing is fascinating. Temporary wooden tracks and scaffolds are erected to ease movement. Logs act as rollers or rails, guiding stones up slopes or across uneven terrain. You carefully navigate between shifting supports and rolling logs, aware that a single slip could trigger disaster. The site is alive with sound. Creaking timber, snapping ropes, oxen groans, shouted commands, and occasional laughter or swearing. Chaos reigns, yet a rhythm emerges, organized mayhem, powered by sweat, muscle, and determination. The team often splits the load to manage weight. Larger stones are partially broken or reinforced with wooden frames. You notice chalk marks or carved symbols on some blocks, early assembly instructions indicating their final place in the wall. Scholars still debate whether these marks were standardized across regions or improvised by individual masons. Fringe theories suggest some symbols encoded secret guild messages, signatures of pride or ownership preserved for posterity. By midday, the journey continues, punctuated by brief rests and the constant smell of sweat. Crushed stone, oxen, and damp earth. Laborers pour water over tracks, adjust wedges, and clear debris. You feel the cadence of centuries-old techniques. Every lever, every rope pull, every cautious footstep honed by generations of trial and error. Some stories even suggest that songs accompanied the labor. Not just to synchronize effort, but as coded instructions, a melodic Morse code for moving stone. As afternoon drifts into evening, the sun casts long shadows over mud-caked oxen and exhausted workers. The stone finally reaches firm ground. You lean against it, muscles trembling, breathing in the mingling scents of earth, sweat, and resin. Each block is a triumph, a physical manifestation of ingenuity, labor, and sometimes superstition. The lucky stones from the quarry have survived the treacherous journey to the construction site, ready to form walls that will one day define the castle. You take a moment to imagine the fortress taking shape, towers rising, battlements forming, walls stretching skyward, all beginning with this single stone delivered by your own worn hands. Your imagination, and countless others who endured the same grueling path. The experience is exhausting, humbling, and almost mystical. You think about the coordination required. Oxen teams, human muscle levers, temporary tracks, and sometimes sheer luck, all converging to bring one block to its rightful place. Fringe tales whisper of stones arriving with faint cracks that only a master mason could read, almost like a letter from the quarry. Historians still debate whether every precaution was truly necessary or if some risk was accepted as inevitability, testament to the combination of ingenuity and raw courage that defined medieval construction. As night falls, you pause. The trail behind you is littered with crushed stones, broken tools, and footprints that will disappear by morning rain. The stone rests at the edge of the castle site, a small monument to centuries of labor, superstition, and human ingenuity. You brush mud from your hands, feeling the weight of history and the thrill of participation. Every block delivered is more than a piece of rock. It is a promise of walls, towers, and keeps that will endure, witness countless generations, and carry the whispers of their builders. You finally arrive at the chosen castle site, the scent of damp earth mingling with crushed stone dust. And you realize that the real artistry of medieval castle building begins here, at the very foundations. The ground itself is alive with subtle signals: the firmness of bedrock, the slope of a hill, the proximity to water sources. You crouch down, fingertips brushing the gritty soil, imagining the weight of centuries pressing down and the towering walls that will one day rise from this spot. Historians still argue whether castles were placed primarily for strategic advantage, like commanding views and natural defenses, or for symbolic prestige meant to dominate the surrounding landscape. Standing here, it's clear that both reasons intertwined, like a chessboard and a stage rolled into one. First comes the clearing of topsoil and leveling of the site. You scrape away loose layers, revealing the compact earth underneath. Even small depressions could undermine the stability of walls that will one day reach 10 meters or more. Masons carefully dig trenches, compact soil, and sometimes insert timber piles or stone piers to reinforce the base. Foundations stretch deep, sometimes 3 or 4 meters below ground, forming a hidden skeleton meant to endure centuries of weather, war, and slow decay. Fringe evidence suggests that coins, small carved figures, or tiny charms were sometimes placed within these foundations, both as protective talismans and as ritualistic offerings. You imagine a mason whispering blessings over a tiny carving before tucking it beneath a stone, knowing it would remain buried for generations. Now the stones themselves take on new identity. Once inert, heavy, and unmoving, they transform into base stones, the literal and figurative support of the castle. You crouch over a dense slab, noting subtle differences in weight, grain, and texture. Heavier blocks go at the bottom, lighter stones on top, forming a solid and stable foundation. Some masons mark the stones with chalk symbols or shallow incisions, indicating their precise orientation and placement within the structure. Scholars still debate whether these marks followed standardized regional conventions or were improvisational, unique to each site. You trace the edges of a stone with your fingers, acutely aware that one misaligned block could compromise the integrity of the entire wall above it. Drainage is critical. Rainwater seeping into foundations could erode months of labor. You kneel beside shallow channels, pebbles, and rudimentary French drain-like systems, visualizing water being diverted harmlessly away. One quirky tidbit: some castles incorporated broken tiles or ceramic fragments to improve drainage, a clever innovation centuries ahead of its time. You probably wouldn't have appreciated it in the mud, but it's a testament to medieval ingenuity and observation. Layout planning continues with wooden stakes, strings, and templates to outline walls, towers, and courtyards. You crouch low, dragging a stick along lines traced in dirt, imagining walls rising perfectly along these guides. Historians still argue whether castle construction followed meticulous blueprints or evolved organically, shaped by terrain quirks, daily labor challenges, and the whims of a lord or master mason. Fringe accounts even suggest that some lords demanded slight asymmetries: a skewed tower here, a subtly uneven wall there, to satisfy superstition or as a personal signature. You can't help smiling, picturing a baron in chainmail, fussing over angles for mystical or aesthetic reasons. The human element is ever present. Laborers haul gravel, sand, and smaller stones to fill voids, preventing shifting. Apprentices carry buckets of water for mortar, their hands slick with clay and lime. Experienced masons check alignments, chisel edges for precise fit, and supervise the placement of heavy blocks. The air is rich with smell: wet earth, smoke from distant fires used to harden lime, and the iron temps of chisels and hammers. Sweat drips down brows, flies buzz, and the low rhythmic pounding of hammers creates a dusty, primal symphony. You notice the choreography, each movement deliberate, almost guided by the terrain itself. Even tiny gaps matter. Stones are laid in alternating layers, voids filled with smaller rocks, and sometimes reinforced with wooden pegs or iron clamps. Scholars still debate whether medieval masons adhered to regional rules of thumb or invented unique techniques per site. You trace a nearly smooth stone, marveling at the care embedded in every joint and surface. Auditory skills guide some work. Master masons often tapped stones to listen for a solid note, an intuitive way of judging stability and density. Fringe theories suggest that certain tapping sequences were believed to ward off misfortune, a blend of superstition and engineering. You imagine a mason whistling softly while testing stones, convinced that a harmonious note equals a sturdy foundation. The process is slow and meticulous. Large stones are set, leveled, and rechecked. Smaller stones and rubble fill gaps. Mortar made of lime, sand, and sometimes animal byproducts is spread carefully, each layer compacted to prevent settling. Apprentices mix mortar in large pits nearby, their hands sticky with lime, while seasoned workers apply it with practiced motions. Dust, water, and mortar create a subtle, earthy aroma that clings to clothing, skin, and hair. By mid-afternoon, the first hints of structure emerge. Stones line up into low walls. Corners begin to define spaces. Trenches fill with carefully placed rubble, and channels for drainage show a hidden logic behind the visible chaos. Shadows stretch across the site as the sun moves, revealing what will become courtyards, towers, and battlements. You pause, heart pounding, hands caked in mud, breathing in the smell of earth and sweat. The castle's story is slowly taking shape. Remember that cursed quarry stone from the earlier section? It has now found its place in the foundation, a silent witness to centuries of toil. You lean back, feeling the cool earth under your palms and sensing the heartbeat of a fortress yet to rise. Each stone represents coordination, planning, superstition, and human endurance. The castle's life begins here, in the earth beneath your hands, invisible yet critical. As evening descends, the site quiets. The rhythmic pounding of hammers softens. Oxen rest nearby. Apprentices settle for a final sip of water. You glance across the newly laid foundations, imagining walls, keeps, and battlements emerging from the shadows. Each stone, each joint, each ritualistic blessing in the mortar is part of a delicate web of construction, ingenuity, and human hope. Even before the first towering walls appear, the castle breathes through its foundations. The sun sets, casting a golden glow over the trenches and stones. You sit on a mound of packed earth, breathing in the mixture of dust, damp soil, and faint smoke from distant fires. The rhythm of work lingers in your muscles and your mind, a hypnotic echo of labor, planning, superstition, and sheer endurance. Every foundation stone laid is a promise to endure storms, sieges, and the passage of centuries. You watch shadows lengthen, imagining the keep rising, the walls stretching, and the fortress asserting its dominance over the landscape. You reflect on the mix of science, intuition, and superstition that brought these foundations to life. Some stones were carefully selected for their weight and durability. Others marked with symbols that might encode guild secrets or mystical protection. Drainage channels hidden beneath earthwork ensured stability, and minor irregularities in layout might satisfy a lord's whimsy or appease unseen forces. Historians still argue which practices were widely employed and which were unique to a particular site or mason. You run your fingers along the rough edges of a base stone, imagining the hammering, the mud, the songs, and whispered prayers that accompanied its journey from quarry to foundation. By nightfall, the foundations stand as a testament to patience, ingenuity, and perseverance. The first tangible layer of the castle emerges from the ground, silent yet alive with potential. Every stone carries the memory of quarry, transport, and careful placement, whispering the labor and superstition embedded in its very fiber. You feel a strange satisfaction, knowing that centuries from now, someone might brush their hand over these stones, unaware of the sweat and intention behind them. This is the heartbeat of construction, the point where imagination, labor, superstition, and skill converge. Even as darkness spreads, you feel the pulse of the fortress beneath your hands. The castle has begun, not in towers or battlements, but in the quiet, deliberate, and painstaking placement of its first stones, forming a foundation that will endure long after the voices of its builders are gone. You stand back and take in the foundation you've helped lay. The earth still damp under your hands, the smell of mortars, stone, and faint smoke curling from distant fires. Now comes the next monumental task: raising the walls. You probably imagine stones simply stacked on top of one another, but the reality is far more complex, requiring ingenuity, balance, and brute force. Each layer must align perfectly. Misalignment could doom the structure. Historians still argue whether medieval masons relied more on rigid rules handed down through guilds or instinct honed by years of trial and error. You grip your hammer, brush dust from your sleeve, and prepare to become part of a living, breathing construction orchestra. The first course of stones sits directly on the prepared foundation, heavy, dense, and carefully aligned. You feel the cool, rough edges beneath your fingers, imagining the load they will bear in centuries to come. Masons sometimes employed simple wooden templates to keep corners square and courses level. Fringe evidence suggests that miniature Charmsteiny carvings of animals, crosses, or geometric symbols were embedded between stones to bring luck, strength, or protection. You glance around and notice the rhythmic pattern emerging: a layer of large stones, a filler of rubble, then mortar, each carefully measured and compacted. Hoisting stones up the first few meters involves an interplay of levers, pulleys, and sheer human muscle. You clutch a rope attached to a pulley, feeling the tension in your forearms as an oxen team strains below. Workers chant or sing, partly to coordinate effort, partly to lighten the mood. The technique is surprisingly efficient. A single misaligned stone could disrupt the balance, but well-trained crews maneuver massive slabs as though they were feathers. Some masons tested stability with a gentle knock or tap, listening for the solid tone that signaled readiness for the next layer. Historians still debate whether this acoustic testing was universal or limited to master masons. As the walls rise, scaffolding becomes essential. You step onto a narrow wooden plank, hands gripping ropes for balance. The smell of sawdust and damp wood mingles with mortar dust. Fringe sources claim that scaffolds were sometimes decorated with small charms or even painted symbols to ward off accidents. You carefully step past a bucket of water for mortar, mindful of slippery planks. The air hums with labor, hammers chipping stone, oxen groaning below, apprentices calling instructions, and the faint clinking of metal clamps holding stones together. Mortar plays a subtle but critical role. Lime-based and often mixed on site, it must be the right consistency. Too wet, and it slumps. Too dry, and it crumbles. You dip your trowel into the mixture, the gritty paste sticking to your fingers, and spread it carefully between courses. Some masons reportedly added crushed animal bones or eggshells to improve adhesion, though scholars still debate the effectiveness. Fringe accounts suggest that tiny blessings or prayers were whispered into the mortar to seal its strength, a curious blend of superstition and practical work. Corners are particularly challenging. You lean over a plumb line, adjusting stones to ensure vertical alignment. Even minor deviations could ripple across the wall, leading to structural failure. Workers shout directions, signaling each other across the scaffolding, while oxen below adjust loads of stones for upper courses. You feel the subtle vibration of effort through the planks, the pulse of coordinated human and animal labor, keeping massive stones steady. Some masons marked individual stones with chalk numbers or symbols to ensure proper placement, though historians still argue whether this was standardized or ad hoc. Raising walls is also a tactile lesson in medieval engineering. You notice the alternating pattern of large and small stones, designed to distribute weight evenly. Rubble fills voids, adding mass and stability. Iron clamps or wooden dowels sometimes reinforce joints. You step back briefly, tracing your hand along a nearly smooth stone, imagining centuries of siege, weather, and the lives of those who will eventually occupy these walls. Fringe evidence suggests that some master masons embedded tiny signatures or pictograms into stones. Hidden from casual view, a secret legacy only other skilled masons might recognize. Scaffolding work is exhausting. Planks sway slightly under your weight. Ropes cut into your palms. You drink from a shared wooden cup, tasting grit, water, and sweat, and take a brief respite to observe how far the wall has risen. Shadows stretch across the site, showing the progress of your labor in striking relief. Apprentices continue hauling smaller stones, mixing mortar, and keeping tools organized. You notice subtle differences in stone texture, some quarried locally, others possibly transported from distant sites for prestige or structural reasons. Historians still argue whether long-distance stones were more symbolic than practical, a blend of aesthetics, status, and engineering. As the day drifts into evening, the wall grows taller and the rhythm of work becomes hypnotic. You hear the steady clink of chisels shaping stones, the low groan of oxen hauling upper course loads, and the faint chants of masons coordinating pulleys. You probably wouldn't survive this long physically, but mentally, you marvel at the sheer ingenuity, coordination, and patience required. Fringe sources hint that certain wall sections were intentionally built slightly thicker or with minor curvature to resist siege weaponry or natural shift. Surly lessons in defensive engineering. Even minor mistakes must be corrected immediately. A slightly misaligned stone is removed, leveled, and reset. Workers consult lines, plumb bobs, and spirit levels, adjusting placement to perfection. Some corners feature interlocking stones, almost like puzzle pieces, a subtle innovation that spreads load and prevents shifting. You step back and note the visual pattern emerging. Every course is deliberate, every joint precise, every stone part of a larger, coordinated structure. Historians still debate whether these techniques were common across regions or unique to master masons of particular guilds. By nightfall, the first real verticality emerges. The foundations have transformed into a rising wall, shadowed and powerful in the fading sunlight. You step back, muscles sore, hands raw, and imagine the keep, battlements, and towers that will one day stretch skyward. Every stone, every tap, every charm or symbol embedded in the mortar is part of a carefully orchestrated story of endurance, superstition, and ingenuity. Fringe legends suggest that workers sometimes whispered warnings or prayers to encourage the stones to settle correctly. A mix of ritual, psychology, and perhaps a little medieval magic. You pause, gazing at the emerging structure. The wall hums with the echo of labor, creativity, and risk, the pulse of a living fortress. It is both practical and symbolic, designed to protect, impress, and endure. Every detail reflects centuries of accumulated knowledge. Placement of stones, composition of mortar, use of pulleys and scaffolds, and careful alignment of corners and courses. You run a finger along a newly set stone, feeling the cold, rough surface, imagining future generations touching the same stone, unaware of the sweat, fear, and ingenuity that went into setting it. By night, shadows deepen, and the clamor of work softens. Oxen are stabled, tools are cleaned, and apprentices collapse near the foundations. The walls, now a tangible silhouette, hint at the castle to come. You feel a deep connection to the rhythm of medieval labor, the combination of strategy, superstition, and sheer physicality that raises walls skyward. Remember the cursed quarry stones? They have now taken their place in the rising structure, a quiet yet defiant testament to human endurance and creativity. As darkness settles, the site exudes a peculiar calm, punctuated by the occasional clink of metal from secured clamps and the distant bark of a watchdog. The walls, newly raised, seem alive with the memory of hands, voices, and tools that touch them. You lean against a stone, breathing in the mingling scents of earth, mortar, and smoke, and feel the pulse of construction reverberating beneath your fingertips. The castle is no longer just an idea, is a physical, breathing entity, slowly emerging, stone by stone, course by course, from the foundations you helped bring to life. You wake to the smell of damp stone and smoke curling from morning fires. And the day ahead is dedicated to the finer details of wall construction, shaping, refining, and preparing stones to interlock perfectly. You probably imagine this as a neat, orderly process, but in reality, it's a blend of precision, improvisation, and a bit of superstition. Historians still debate whether masons followed strict measurements from detailed blueprints or relied primarily on experience and intuition honed over years. Either way, every stone, every chisel mark is part of a grand, centuries-long conversation between human ingenuity and the raw materials of nature. Shaping stones is an art form. Large slabs are rough-hewn from the quarry, but they rarely fit perfectly on first inspection. You kneel beside a block, running your hands along its uneven edges, envisioning the final fit in the wall. Masons use chisels, hammers, and mallets to pare down irregularities. Each strike is deliberate, guided by experience and a subtle, tactile understanding of the stone's grain. Fringe accounts suggest some masons believed stones had a temper, almost like living entities, and required gentle persuasion rather than brute force. You tap lightly, listening for a sound that indicates solidity and auditory cue as much as a physical one. Mortar preparation continues nearby. Lime is slaked in large pits, mixed with sand, water, and occasionally crushed eggshells or animal byproducts to improve cohesion. You dip a trowel into the mixture, feeling the gritty texture adhere to your fingers. Some masons whispered blessings into the mortar, a curious blend of superstition and confidence-building ritual. Scholars still argue whether such practices were widespread or limited to specific regions and guilds. The mortar, combined with precise stone placement, forms the invisible glue that ensures walls endure centuries of weather, siege, and settlement. Cornerstones demand extra attention. They are the anchors of the entire structure, bearing loads from multiple directions. You crouch beside a massive stone, checking alignment with a plumb line and the adjacent stones, adjusting it carefully. Apprentices haul smaller filler stones, while experienced masons supervise, correcting any deviations that could compromise stability. Fringe evidence hints at symbols or initials carved into cornerstones, a signature of pride or a form of quiet communication among masons. You run your fingers along the carved lines, imagining centuries of hidden stories embedded in each mark. Rising walls require ingenuity and movement. Pulleys, wooden scaffolds, and counterweights allow stones to be lifted safely to upper courses. You grip a rope, feeling the tension and weight, coordinating with a team that shouts instructions in rhythmic cadence. The scent of wet wood and dust fills your nostrils, mingling with the faint aroma of lime from freshly mixed mortar. Some masons sang songs not only for morale, but as a primitive way to synchronize efforts across the scaffolding, ensuring that heavy stones moved in unison. Historians still debate whether musical coordination was common or occasional, but it's a charming mental image. Gaps between stones are filled with rubble or smaller, carefully shaped blocks. You select pieces, testing them for fit, adjusting until the course is level and secure. The pattern emerges, alternating large and small stones, mortar compressed to a uniform thickness, voids meticulously packed. Fringe accounts suggest that in some cases, small charms or talismans were hidden in these gaps, offering mystical protection or good fortune to the structure. You smile, imagining a tiny carved animal or coin nestled unseen, quietly safeguarding the castle. As the walls rise, you notice the subtle curvature in some sections, slight outward flare designed to resist battering and improve stability. You measure with a simple plumb line, confirming the intended angle. Historians still debate how widespread such design techniques were. But some evidence points to deliberate engineering aimed at deflecting projectiles or distributing weight. The walls are becoming more than stone. They are carefully calibrated instruments of defense. Scaffolds groan under weight, ropes cut into palms, and sweat runs into your eyes. You step back for a moment, hands caked in mud, inhaling the complex aromas of the site. Earth, dust, mortar, and a faint tang of iron from tools. Apprentices continue hauling stones, mixing mortar, and observing instructions. The environment is chaotic yet ordered, every motion contributing to the emergence of a formidable fortress. Fringe accounts mention that some masons believed whispering protective words into the wall, as it rose, could strengthen the structure. A subtle psychological reinforcement that may have calmed nerves as much as it magically ensured stability. Open-air work exposes you to the elements. Morning frost makes surfaces slick. Midday sun bakes hands and backs. Sudden rain threatens mortar setting. You wipe sweat and dust from your brow, mindful that every course laid in less than ideal conditions requires careful correction. Some historical records suggest that masons paused work during extreme weather, while others adapted, using improvised shelters or altering mortar composition. You trudge along the scaffold, balancing between the physical demands of lifting stone and the mental focus required to maintain precision. By afternoon, the walls have grown noticeably taller. Shadows stretch across the site, creating a dynamic play of light and form that accentuates your progress. The first hints of battlements and arrow slits appear in the layout, even if rough at this stage. You step back, tracing the lines with your eyes, appreciating the interplay of human skill and material. Each stone placed is a layer in the story, a testament to patience, expertise, and the quiet ingenuity of those who came before. Historians still argue whether all design elements were fully pre-planned or evolved organically, responding to terrain and available materials. Corners, gates, and openings demand extra precision. You check the plumb line and straight edge against each course, ensuring that structural integrity remains uncompromised. Apprentices support by passing stones and mortar, moving in a practiced rhythm that keeps the pace steady. Fringe accounts suggest that some masons left subtle hidden signatures in key stones, a carved line, a small dot, or an initial visible only to the trained eye, a private communication across time. You glance at a faintly marked block and imagine centuries from now, someone noticing the subtle signature and wondering about the craftsman behind it. As the day winds down, the wall stands taller, more imposing, and more alive with human effort. The pulse of work lingers, hammers striking stone, ropes taut with weight, oxen resting after hauling, apprentices laughing and calling instructions. Every stone, from the largest block at the base to smaller filler pieces higher up, represents coordination, skill, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Fringe tales claim that certain blocks were placed with specific rituals, prayers, or blessings, blending superstition with practical construction, fascinating insight into the medieval mindset. The sun sets, casting elongated shadows that stretch across trenches and scaffolding. You pause on a plank, hands worn and back aching, breathing deeply. The walls, now clearly rising from the foundations, form silhouettes that hint at towers, keeps, and defensive works yet to come. The castle is taking shape, stone by stone, hammer by hammer, and a strange, almost magical rhythm emerges from the chaos. Even the so-called cursed quarry stones from earlier stages have found their place, silent but resolute in their contribution to the fortress's longevity. You take one last glance at the growing wall before descending the scaffold. Dust coats your hands and face, your muscles ache, and yet there is a deep satisfaction in witnessing the transformation from earth and raw stone to rising architecture. This is the heartbeat of construction: patience, coordination, and subtle innovation combining to create something that will endure centuries. Shadows lengthen, the air cools, and the site hums softly with the memory of effort, skill, and human ingenuity. Every stone now set carries a story. a whisper of the countless hands and minds that shaped it, an invisible yet tangible testament to medieval craftsmanship. You wake to another crisp morning, the sun barely piercing through mist that clings to the foundations, and today's labor is all about precision, laying stones for the inner walls and starting the essential work on defensive structures. The castle is beginning to breathe now. Not just a pile of rocks, but a carefully orchestrated fortress designed to endure and intimidate. You trudge alongside apprentices, hauling buckets of mortar and small stones, feeling every bump in the uneven ground beneath your boots. Historians still argue whether the inner curtain walls were primarily defensive, or if they evolved organically as storage and living spaces were needed. But standing here, the dual purpose seems obvious: fortification and habitation intertwined. Stone selection is paramount. You kneel beside a pile, testing each slab for density, grain, and fit. Larger stones form the primary structure, while smaller, irregular ones fill gaps and stabilize courses. Fringe evidence suggests that some masons believed certain stones preferred specific positions, almost as if they had personalities. You can't help smiling at the thought, tapping a block lightly and murmuring, "Settle here, friend." The belief may have been superstition, but it also encouraged careful attention and handling, a practical effect disguised as ritual. Mortar mixing continues near the trench. Lime, sand, and water are blended into a paste thick enough to support weight, but workable enough to slide into cracks. Some records hint that crushed eggshells, animal bones, or even ash were added to improve adhesion. You scoop a trowelful, feeling it clinging to your fingers, and smear it between stones. Fringe accounts say that small prayers or whispered words were sometimes incorporated into the mixture, an invisible layer of superstition reinforcing physical labor. Scholars still debate whether such rituals were regional quirks or widespread practice. Corners and junctions demand heightened focus. You lean over a plumb line, adjusting a large stone while an apprentice holds it steady. Each misalignment could cause cumulative errors higher up, compromising the wall's integrity. You notice subtle chalk marks, likely instructions for placement or orientation. Though historians still argue whether these symbols followed a universal code or were improvised, some evidence even suggests small pictograms or initials carved into keystones. A mason's secret signature preserved for centuries, visible only to those trained to recognize it. Scaffolding creaks beneath your weight. Wooden planks stretch across temporary supports, forming elevated pathways for stone placement. Ropes run taut, pulleys squeak, and buckets of mortar sway dangerously with each movement. You step cautiously, inhaling the mingling scents of wet wood, dust, and lime. Apprentices move rhythmically, passing stones and tools while seasoned masons direct traffic and ensure alignment. Fringe theories propose that decorations or small charms on scaffolds warded off accidents or boosted morale, blending practical construction with ritual. You chuckle, imagining a tiny carved animal perched atop a plank as a guardian of falling stones. Rising walls also require careful management of weight distribution. Large blocks sit at the base, smaller stones fill voids, and mortar ties everything together. You notice subtle flares in the wall sections, deliberately designed to resist siege engines or prevent slumping. Historians still debate whether these techniques were consciously engineered or developed through trial and error. But the effect is undeniable. Stability and resilience built into the very geometry of the stones. Defensive structures start to take form. Arrow slits, murder holes, and raised platforms are faintly visible in sketches drawn on the ground. You help position stones for a corner tower, the base stones now massive and deliberately interlocked. Fringe accounts suggest that some corners were slightly skewed or curved to deflect projectiles. Early experiment in ballistic engineering. Every stone you set contributes to a network of defense that combines brute strength, subtle angles, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Communication among workers is continuous. You hear calls, songs, and rhythmic chants coordinating lifts, mortar application, and scaffolding movement. Some songs may have been coded instructions, signaling direction or weight adjustment. You likely wouldn't survive the coordination without focus and experience, but the rhythm creates a hypnotic, almost ASMR-like flow. Even the oxen's low groans and the occasional shout of a foreman become part of this organized symphony of construction. As midday approaches, the walls are visibly taller, more imposing, and the first hints of interior courtyards appear. You step back and observe the interplay of light and shadow on newly laid stone. The emerging patterns of interlocked blocks and carefully placed mortar. Fringe evidence suggests that hidden niches or small recesses were sometimes carved to house charms or protective talismans, blending superstition with function. You run a finger along a smooth block, imagining the hands that placed it centuries ago, each strike of the hammer and chisel echoing across time. Weather intervenes subtly, morning mist thickens, making planks slick. A light drizzle dampens mortar. The sun emerges briefly, heating stone and scaffolds. You wipe sweat and moisture from your brow and carefully adjust a slab. Every small adaptation, the timing of lifting, the angle of placement, the choice of mortar, consistency demonstrates the ingenuity of medieval builders. Fringe accounts suggest that some masons timed work around lunar phases, believing certain days favored stronger set mortars, a curious blend of observation and superstition. By afternoon, the inner walls are taking shape, rising with purposeful symmetry. You balance on a plank, sweat dripping, hands raw, and watch as apprentices ferry stones and mortar while master masons oversee placement. Every course is deliberate, each joint carefully compressed, and every filler stone precisely positioned. Historians still argue whether medieval construction manuals existed in standardized form, or if the entire process relied on oral instruction and apprenticeship. Your presence, even in imagination, gives you a sense of participating in that continuum of knowledge. Corners, arches, and doorways emerge as focal points. You assist in setting stones for the base of an arched doorway, carefully wedging each block. Fringe accounts suggest that a small charm might be placed in the keystone of arches for luck or stability. Quiet nod to superstition intertwined with engineering. Probably wouldn't survive ignoring these subtle practices, as the consequences for misalignment or imbalance could be catastrophic. Every stone you set contributes to a complex network of stability, defense, and design. By evening, the walls tower over you, still incomplete but imposing. Shadows stretch across scaffolds, trenches, and foundations, creating a dynamic interplay of light on stone. You pause, muscles aching, mud caked on hands and boots, and inhale deeply the scent of damp earth, lime, and mortar. The walls seem alive, whispering stories of the labor, ingenuity, superstition, and sheer persistence that brought them into existence. Fringe legends hint that workers would sometimes leave subtle signatures or symbols in stones, invisible to the untrained eye but meaningful to fellow masons, a secret dialogue across generations. The pulse of construction lingers. You notice oxen settling nearby, apprentices laughing softly after a long day, and the distant calls of guards. Every stone now set carries a piece of human effort, an echo of superstition, and the tactile precision that ensures centuries of durability. Even the so-called cursed quarry stones from earlier stages now rest confidently in place, their rough edges transformed into integral components of a growing fortress. The castle is no longer just a vision. It is a living structure, stone by stone, mortar by mortar, rising from earth and imagination into reality. Night falls, cool and quiet. The site hums softly with memory and labor, the echo of hammers, the tension of ropes, the silent presence of carefully interlocked stone. You lean against a wall, exhausted, sensing the pulse of the emerging castle beneath your fingertips. Shadows stretch across mortar lines, and you feel the rhythm of medieval construction, the blend of ingenuity, superstition, and sheer perseverance that has brought the inner walls into existence. The fortress now has form, and the story of its creation continues, layer by layer, as the sun sets and the laborers rest. Ready to resume the careful orchestration of stone and mortar come morning. You rise with the morning sun, the chill in the air carrying the scent of damp stone and sawdust. And today's labor is dedicated to towers, battlements, and the subtle art of verticality. The castle is no longer just walls and foundations. It is reaching skyward, asserting dominance over the landscape. You probably imagine this as simple stacking, but in reality, it is an intricate dance of physics, skill, and careful calculation. Historians still argue whether the exact dimensions of towers were based more on aesthetic impression or defensive necessity, but standing here, it feels like both were inseparable. The base of a tower demands absolute precision. You kneel beside massive cornerstones, checking alignment with plumb lines and adjusting placement. Each misalignment could ripple upward, compromising the entire structure. Fringe accounts hint that some towers included slightly tapered walls wider at the base and narrower at the top to resist siege engines and add visual grandeur. You run your hands along the stone, feeling subtle curves and irregularities that reveal both the ingenuity and improvisation inherent in medieval construction. Hoisting stones for upper courses requires scaffolding, pulleys, and sheer human muscle. You grip a rope, coordinating with workers below, while apprentices pass stones and buckets of mortar. The air is thick with dust and sweat, mingling with the faint aroma of burned lime and damp earth. Some masons reportedly sang songs while lifting, not just for rhythm, but to instill courage and focus. A melodic mnemonic for coordinated effort. Historians still debate whether such practices were widespread or occasional. But imagining the chorus of voices as stones ascended adds a hypnotic, almost meditative layer to the labor. Battlements are more than decoration. They are defensive instruments. You help position crenellations and parapets, carefully wedging stones into place to allow archers a clear line of fire. Fringe theories suggest that certain stone arrangements or hidden grooves were intentionally designed to deflect projectiles or enhance structural stability, blending practical engineering with subtle innovation. You step back to admire the emerging pattern, alternating gaps in solid sections, forming both an intimidating silhouette and a functional defensive barrier. Inside towers, staircases, and internal chambers begin to emerge. You trace the layout of a spiral staircase, imagining the laborers, soldiers, and messengers who will navigate it for centuries. Stones must fit perfectly to support both weight and motion, and mortars is applied with precision to ensure durability. Some historical accounts suggest that secret niches or hidden spaces were included for supplies or escape routes, a blend of practicality and clandestine ingenuity. Fringe sources hint that masons sometimes left tiny carvings or initials hidden in staircases, a silent signature for future generations. The work is physically demanding. You climb scaffolds, balance on narrow planks, and haul heavy stones while coordinating with dozens of others. Oxen below strain against ropes, while apprentices move smaller stones and tools. The ambient sound clinking chisels, groaning pulleys, shouted commands. An occasional laughter creates a hypnotic rhythm, a primitive symphony of construction. Historians still argue whether training relied mostly on apprenticeship and oral instruction, or if written guides played a significant role. But observing the teamwork, you sense that hands-on experience was paramount. Weather and material variations influence every decision. Rain can make scaffolds slippery. Heat can dry mortar too quickly. You adjust by moistening mortar, repositioning scaffolding, or slowing the tempo. Fringe accounts claim that some masons timed construction around lunar cycles, believing certain days improved mortar strength or stone stability. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these subtle adaptations, as even minor miscalculations at height could result in disaster. As towers rise, so do defensive features. Arrow slits are carefully carved, murder holes positioned above entrances. Amachicolations form overhangs for dropping objects on intruders. You carefully set stones, aligning with previously measured templates, while apprentices ensure mortar fills every void. Some stones carry hidden symbols or tiny carvings, serving as both protective charms and subtle signatures of the craftsman. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but imagining the secret legacy adds a layer of intrigue to each block you handle. By midday, the castle has gained verticality. Shadows stretch across scaffolding, highlighting the interlocking stones, tapered walls, and defensive projections. You pause, breathing in the mix of dust, lime, and earthy aromas, appreciating how every stone contributes to structural integrity and visual impact. Fringe evidence suggests that some corners or tower bases were slightly skewed or angled to resist battering rams or catapults. An early form of defensive engineering blending intuition with experimentation. The rhythm of work continues uninterrupted. You climb higher, adjusting stones, applying mortar, and listening for the solid note. That signals proper placement. Apprentices carry smaller stones, while seasoned masons supervise, ensuring alignment, load distribution, and aesthetic symmetry. Every action is deliberate, a careful balance of science, tradition, and superstition. You glance at a small carved animal hidden in a stone's recess, imagining the mason's hand and thoughts centuries ago. By evening, the towers stand proudly, imposing silhouettes against the horizon. Scaffolds groan under residual weight, oxen settle, and apprentices collapse in fatigue. You lean against a newly laid block, hands raw and back aching, reflecting on the blend of creativity, endurance, and subtle ritual that has brought the fortress this far. Even the supposedly cursed quarry stones from earlier stages now feel integral, silent witnesses to centuries of labor and ingenuity. The sun sets, painting the rising towers in golden light. You inhale the cool evening air, filled with dust, mortar, and distant smoke, sensing the pulse of construction beneath your fingertips. Every stone, every chisel mark, every whispered charm or signature is now part of a cohesive castle, not just of stone, but of human effort, superstition, and enduring knowledge. You probably wouldn't survive a day in this environment without focus, care, and respect for both material and method. Yet the satisfaction of seeing the structure take shape is profound. Night descends quietly. The towers stand like sentinels in shadow, the scaffolding empty, but still echoing with the memory of labor. You lean against a stone, exhausted but contemplative, feeling the living pulse of a fortress rising skyward. The castle breathes now, not as a concept, but as a tangible, enduring structured story written in stone, mortars, and the collective sweat, skill, and superstition of those who built it. You wake to the soft creak of scaffolding and the earthy scent of mortar still lingering in the morning air. And today your focus shifts to the roof structures, battlements, and defensive parapets. The castle is no longer a flat expanse of walls and towers. It's a vertical living entity beginning to assert dominance over the surrounding landscape. You probably imagine the roof as a simple cover, but in reality, its construction is a careful balance of weight, water management, and structural ingenuity. Historians still argue whether roof designs prioritize defensive function, aesthetic grandeur, or a blend of both. But standing here, it's clear that all three drove the choices made. Timber is your primary medium today, brought from nearby forests and shaped on-site. Massive beams are cut, trimmed, and notched to fit into the stone walls. You feel the rough wood under your hands, noticing knots, grain direction, and natural imperfections. Fringe accounts suggest that some master carpenters would whisper or murmur to the beams as they worked, almost as if coaxing the wood into place. While it sounds whimsical, this practice may have encouraged careful attention and patience, subtly improving outcomes. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these minor rituals, given the precision required to support heavy roofing stones or tiles. The roof structure is assembled on scaffolding that hugs the upper walls. You carefully lift a beam into place, coordinating with others below. Pulleys, ropes, and sheer human muscle are all essential. The air hums with the effort of dozens of workers moving massive materials in unison. Songs, calls, and rhythmic chants keep coordination smooth. Historians still debate whether these vocalizations were primarily practical or also fused with tradition and morale-boosting intent, but they certainly contribute to a hypnotic, almost ASMR-like rhythm as stones and timbers rise. Battlements begin to take shape as well. You carefully lay stones for crenellations and parapets, aligning each block with meticulous precision. Some stones are shaped to interlock or flare slightly outward, enhancing defensive capacity while adding aesthetic flair. Fringe evidence hints that certain blocks were subtly carved with initials or symbols, a hidden signature of the mason that only fellow craftsmen would recognize. You trace the edges, imagining the centuries of hands and eyes that will eventually encounter these same stones. Drainage is a constant concern. Rainwater seeping into the structure could compromise years of labor. So you observe channels, slight slopes, and the placement of roof stones to ensure runoff is controlled. Some masons used broken pottery or tiles in the sloped areas, an ingenious solution centuries ahead of its time. Historians still argue whether these techniques were widely applied or limited to elite constructions, but their effectiveness is undeniable. You run your fingers along the sloped stone, feeling the careful planning embedded in each course. Chimneys, vents, and small openings for light and air are integrated into the rising roof structure. You measure, adjust, and place each stone with attention to airflow, weight distribution, and structural stability. Fringe accounts claim that tiny protective charms or carvings were sometimes inserted into these apertures, blending superstition with practicality. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these subtle measures, as misaligned stones or poorly considered weight could compromise the integrity of the upper walls and towers. Inside the emerging structure, wooden scaffolding forms temporary floors, allowing access to interior areas. You carefully navigate planks, carrying stones, mortars, and tools, while apprentices ferry smaller items. The rhythmic pounding of hammers, the occasional groan of timber, and distant chants create an immersive soundscape echoing through half-constructed walls. Historians still debate whether scaffolding methods were standardized or improvised for each site. But observing the efficiency here, improvisation seems guided by experience and acute spatial awareness. By midday, battlements are almost complete. You adjust the last few stones of a crenellation, ensuring even spacing for defensive purposes and aesthetic balance. Fringe evidence suggests that some masons deliberately included minor irregularities to break monotony, add character, or even confuse potential attackers, an unexpected fusion of art and engineering. You stand back, brushing dust from your hands, and watch the silhouette of the castle rise proudly against the skyline. Roof tiling begins in earnest. Large stone slabs or clay tiles are lifted into position, carefully overlapped to prevent water penetration. You work alongside apprentices, adjusting angles and applying final mortar to secure each piece. Some historical sources suggest that specific patterns or sequences in tile placement were believed to bring luck or protection to the inhabitants. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic, ritualistic, or purely practical. But you feel a faint thrill imagining these small, deliberate choices preserved for centuries. The sun begins its descent, casting elongated shadows across scaffolding, battlements, and roof lines. You pause on a plank, hands sore, back aching, and gaze at the castle now taking its full shape. The silhouette is a study in balance. Towers taper upward, walls interlock, battlements flare slightly, and roofs slope with subtle precision. Fringe legends hint that some of the higher stones were blessed or spoken to, as they were placed a psychological ritual that likely encouraged concentration and care more than mystical protection. By evening, the roof structure is nearly complete, battlements secure, and internal scaffolding ready to be dismantled. The castle is no longer a flat, skeletal structure. It is vertical, imposing, and unmistakably alive with centuries of labor and ingenuity. You lean against a newly set parapet, inhaling the mix of dust, timber, and mortar. and feel the pulse of construction beneath your fingertips. Every stone, beam, and charm carries a story, a blend of superstition, practical knowledge, and human persistence that transforms raw materials into enduring architecture. Night falls quietly. The site hums softly with memory, the echo of hammers, groaning timber, and whispered guidance. You watch shadows stretch across battlements and roofs, sensing the rhythm of centuries-old construction techniques. Even the allegedly cursed quarry stones now rest securely in place, integral to towers, walls, and battlements. The castle stands resilient, not just in stone, but in the collective memory of hands, minds, and traditions that created it. You probably wouldn't survive a day here without focus and respect, but the satisfaction of witnessing the transformation from raw material to living fortress is profound. You wake to the faint smell of smoke and wet stone, the castle now looming taller and more complete than ever. And today, your labor focuses on finishing touches. Interior courtyards, gatehouses, drawbridges, and the subtle artistry that transforms the fortress from raw structure into lived-in space. You probably imagine the final stages as quick or decorative. But in reality, they are as critical as foundations and walls, requiring precision, coordination, and, occasionally, a touch of superstition. Historians still argue whether these interior structures prioritized function or prestige, or if the distinction blurred entirely. But walking among partially completed walls, the dual purpose is evident. The gatehouse is your first focus. Massive stones are lifted into place for arches and supports. You check alignment with plumb lines, ensuring that the weight of the gate above will be evenly distributed. Fringe accounts suggest that small, charm-steiny carvings of animals, symbols, or coins were sometimes placed in the stonework to protect the gate, blending superstition with structural caution. You probably wouldn't survive a misaligned arch, so careful attention is critical. Apprentices haul smaller stones, and seasoned masons supervise, correcting any deviations. The air hums with the rhythm of coordinated labor. Pulleys squeak, hammers tap, and commands echo across the site. Drawbridges demand particular ingenuity. You observe the placement of heavy wooden beams, chains, and counterweights, all designed to allow smooth raising and lowering. Some historical accounts suggest that secret grooves or hidden pivots were sometimes integrated to improve durability or resist sabotage. Fringe evidence hints that masons occasionally embedded protective talismans in drawbridge supports, a symbolic gesture to safeguard the entrance. You step carefully along the wooden beams, testing balance and alignment, feeling the tension in ropes and chains as you ensure everything functions correctly. Interior courtyards begin to emerge from flattened soil and stone layouts. Pathways are leveled with gravel, small drainage channels are carved, and foundation blocks for storage areas, kitchens, and workshops are set. Fringe accounts suggest that masons sometimes placed small carved figures or charms beneath cornerstone slabs for luck, echoing the practices used in the main walls. Historians still debate whether these practices were purely symbolic or part of a functional ritual intended to protect structures from collapse. You kneel, brushing dirt from a foundational stone, imagining centuries of foot traffic, markets, and the daily life of castle inhabitants above. Water management remains critical. Wells, cisterns, and channels are integrated to provide drinking water and manage runoff from roofs and courtyards. You help position stones to create a subtle slope, ensuring water flows away from living quarters. Some fringe accounts suggest small charms or offerings were dropped into cisterns as a symbolic gesture for good water or protection. Historians still argue whether these were common practices or isolated to specific regions. You probably wouldn't survive neglecting drainage. The integrity of the entire castle depends on these unseen systems. Staircases, both spiral and straight, rise within towers and walls. You carefully set stones, checking each for fit, stability, and alignment. Fringe evidence hints that masons sometimes carved initials, small symbols, or animals on hidden surfaces, a quiet signature for future generations. Historians still debate whether spiral staircases universally favored right-hand ascent for defenders or if local variations existed. You trace a spiral, imagining soldiers and servants moving stealthily or rushing during an alarm, each step a test of design and function. Arrow slits, murder holes, and defensive niches receive final attention. Stones are adjusted to allow optimal lines of fire. Angles are refined, and mortar is compressed for longevity. Fringe accounts suggest some slits were deliberately asymmetrical to confuse attackers or create strategic advantage in inventive fusion of art and war. You step back, tracing the rhythm of battlements and defensive openings, marveling at the careful interplay between safety, function, and visual impact. Work is physically demanding, but increasingly refined. You move along scaffolds, balancing with careful footwork while adjusting stones, ensuring joints are tight and corners secure. Apprentices mix mortar, ferry tools, and carry smaller stones, while master masons supervise and correct alignment. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring small errors. A single misaligned stone in a gatehouse or battlement could compromise hours of labor. Every action is deliberate, a careful blend of practicality, superstition, and the accumulated knowledge of generations. By afternoon, the castle is nearly complete. Courtyards, towers, walls, and battlements coalesce into a cohesive whole. The drawbridge functions smoothly. Arrow slits are strategically placed, and the roof lines follow gentle slopes that manage rain and snow. Fringe legends suggest that certain cornerstone stones were kissed or tapped by masons as a blessing for the structure. A ritualistic gesture with psychological as much as mystical function. You probably wouldn't survive without respect for both craft and superstition, but it adds a layer of charm to the rigorous labor. Interior space, storage rooms, kitchens, halls are leveled and framed with stone. Drainage channels are checked, mortars re-examined, and scaffolds begin to be dismantled carefully to avoid disturbing delicate upper courses. You pause to appreciate the interplay of walls, towers, battlements, and internal spaces, imagining the bustle of inhabitants, the echo of footsteps, and the rhythm of daily castle life. Historians still argue whether layouts prioritize defense, comfort, or symbolic authority, but standing here, the integration of all three is undeniable. By evening, the castle is fully recognizable. Towers reach skyward, battlements line the walls, and interior courtyards provide functionality and order. Shadows stretch across parapets and courtyards, highlighting the craftsmanship and subtle quirks embedded in the structure. Even the supposedly cursed quarry stones now feel essential, each one contributing to the strength and character of the fortress. The castle pulses with centuries of labor, ingenuity, and superstition, the tactile memory of hands, minds, and rituals embedded in stone and mortar. You lean against a newly laid wall, exhausted but contemplative, feeling the rhythm of construction echo beneath your fingertips. The castle is no longer a concept. 'Tis a living structure, resilient, imposing, and undeniably human. Every stone, every joint, every hidden charm or signature is part of a narrative that spans centuries. A story of endurance, creativity, and belief. Night falls quietly, the site humming softly with memory, ready for the final touches tomorrow. You wake to the crisp scent of morning air, mixed with mortar dust, the castle now towering and complete in silhouette, and today's labor is the final flourish. Detailing battlements, finishing interior spaces, and securing every stone so the fortress stands for centuries. You probably imagine the last stage as ceremonial, but in reality, it is meticulous, precise, and just as physically demanding as the first stone laid. Historians still argue whether finishing touches were primarily practical, symbolic, or a combination of both, but standing here, the answer seems evident. Function, defense, and prestige are inseparable. You begin with the battlements, carefully checking each crenellation, parapet, and gap. Stones are adjusted, mortar re-examined, and the subtle angles perfected. Fringe accounts suggest that small carvings, animals, initials, or abstract symbols were sometimes embedded into the last course as a signature or blessing. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these minor details. Even a slight misalignment could compromise defensive efficiency. Apprentices ferry stones and tools while seasoned masons direct placement, ensuring uniformity across walls, towers, and gates. The roof receives its final inspection. You balance along timber scaffolds, checking that tiles or stones are properly overlapped, that slopes channel rainwater effectively, and that weight distribution is even less. Some historical sources indicate that occasional decorative elements, such as finials or carved gargoyles, were added not only for aesthetics, but to channel water away from critical walls. Fringe evidence suggests these carvings might also have served as protective symbols against misfortune or attack, a charming blend of practicality and superstition. Interior spaces are next. You step carefully over half-finished floors, leveling stones for kitchens, halls, storage rooms, and corridors. Drainage channels are verified, doorways reinforced, and staircases double-checked for stability. Spiral staircases within towers are particularly delicate. You set stones one at a time, aligning each precisely, mindful of centuries of footsteps yet to come. Fringe accounts hint that small inscriptions or initials were sometimes hidden in staircases, leaving a silent mark of the masons who labored here. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but the thought of invisible communication across generations is intriguing. The gatehouse, drawbridge, and defensive openings are finalized. You test mechanisms, adjust pivots, and ensure structural integrity. Every arrow slit, murder hole, and matriculation is inspected for functional clarity, defensive angle, and longevity. Fringe evidence suggests that some masons added tiny, concealed markings or symbols to signal proper maintenance or original craftsmanship, a subtle dialogue with the future. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these details. The strength of the castle relies on precise execution and foresight. Water management remains a constant concern. You check channels, cisterns, and drainage points one last time, ensuring runoff does not compromise walls or foundations. Some masons reportedly placed small charms or offerings in cisterns as symbolic protections. Historians still argue whether these gestures were superstitious or practical, but they certainly reflect a careful attention to detail and psychological reassurance during construction. You kneel, adjusting a stone in a water channel, imagining centuries of rain flowing safely past the castle's foundations. Courtyards are leveled and tidied. Gravel is raked, pathways defined, and minor gaps between stones filled. Apprentices sweep dust and debris, while you and the masons verify alignment, slope, and general usability. Fringe accounts suggest that subtle patterns or carvings in paving stones were sometimes included as charms or commemorations. A blend of artistry, ritual, and function. You probably wouldn't survive a careless placement here. Even minor errors in drainage or leveling could affect centuries of use. By midday, the castle stands complete in form, structure, and defensive logic. You walk along walls and parapets, feeling the rough surface of stones, the grit of mortar, and the subtle curves built for stability. Towers rise sharply, rooflines slope gently, battlements stand ready, and courtyards gleam faintly under the sun. Fringe legends hint that master masons occasionally tapped or kissed the final stones as a blessing, a psychological closure as much as a superstition. Historians still debate whether these gestures were symbolic or practical, but the ritual conveys a satisfying sense of completion. The final checks occupy the afternoon. You inspect corners, arches, and hidden niches, verifying integrity and alignment. Apprentices adjust minor imperfections, while master masons scrutinize mortar joints, stone fit, and placement. The air is thick with dust, sweat, and the faint aroma of charred lime from earlier mortar fires. Every stone, every joint, Every hidden charm now contributes to a resilient and imposing fortress. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these final touches. The castle's endurance depends on the precision of the finishing labor. As evening falls, the castle is more than a collection of stone. It is a living testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and subtle superstition. You lean against a battlement, exhausted but reflective, tracing the contours of walls, parapets, and towers. Every stone carries the legacy of hands, minds, and rituals that raised it, layer by layer, course by course. Even the allegedly cursed quarry stones now feel vital, integrated seamlessly into a structure meant to outlast centuries of weather, siege, and history. The final light softens the landscape. Shadows stretch across walls and towers, highlighting the rhythm and precision of construction. The castle hums faintly with memory. The echo of hammers, the tension of ropes, the whisper of wind across battlements. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring this delicate balance of labor, superstition, and ingenuity, but observing it now, you feel the pulse of medieval craftsmanship in every stone and joint. Courtyards, towers, battlements, roofs, and internal spaces merge into a cohesive whole. The castle breathes, not as raw material, but as an enduring creation, a monument to human effort, knowledge, and ritual. You sit quietly, hands covered in dust, muscles aching, and gaze across the completed fortress. Every stone tells a story, every mortar line a memory, every hidden charm or signature a quiet whisper across centuries. The castle now stands ready to face time itself, a durable living testament to the art and endurance of its builders. Now, the day has quieted, and the castle rests beneath a sky fading from amber to deep indigo. You sit on a low wall, hands worn, back aching, and let your gaze wander over the silhouette of towers. Walls and battlements softened by evening shadows. The rhythmic clamor of hammers and scaffolds is gone, replaced by the gentle sigh of wind through arrow slits, rustling of distant leaves, and the soft trickle of water from channels and cisterns. Every stone, every joint, every tiny signature left by a mason or apprentice whispers history, a delicate memory woven into the structure itself. You trace your fingers along a wall, feeling the grain of stone and the rough texture of mortar, imagining the hands that shaped, lifted, and positioned each piece. Those long-ago workers, with sweat on brows and songs in their voices, infused each course with skill, superstition, and care. Even the quirky rituals, the whispered words into mortar, tiny carvings hidden in staircases, or charms tucked into niches, become a part of the castle's essence, subtle fingerprints of human presence that endure in silence. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were, but to you, they feel alive, bridging centuries. The castle, now complete, seems to breathe with a gentle rhythm. Shadows stretch, softened by the fading light. And the scent of stone, earth, and lingering mortar becomes comforting rather than sharp. The labor, effort, and ingenuity that raised this fortress transform into a quiet reassurance. Human determination and creativity can endure, even through time's quiet passage. You feel the structure's pulse slow, the atmosphere softening, inviting reflection and calm. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let yourself drift alongside the echo of hammers, the murmur of water, and the centuries of whispers embedded in stone. The castle stands, enduring, patient, and steadfast, just as your mind settles into this gentle, timeless rhythm.